Wonderful story of love. Tell it to me again. Wonderful story of love. With the immortal strain. Angels with rapture announce it. Shepherds with wonder receive it. Sinner, oh, won't you believe it? Wonderful story of love. 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 Though you are far away. Wonderful story of love. Still he doth call today. Calling from Calvary's mountain, down from the crystal bright fountain.
Book of Exodus, chapter 5. We're in the third 40 years of his life at this point. Moses, we're going to find out at the end of this book, was how old when he died? 120 years old when he died. It's actually a pretty amazing thing because the Bible is pretty clear that his eyesight was just as clear as it ever had been, and the strength of his body was just as great as it ever had been. In 120 years, he had not aged the way I have aged in 50. But 120 years is how long he was here, and his life neatly breaks up into 40-year blocks. There's the first 40 years that he spent growing up in Egypt. There's the 40 years he spent in Midian, and then there's the 40 years he spent leading the Israelites out of bondage into the promised land. We're in that third block. It says afterward, this is after Moses and Aaron had talked to the assembled people of Israel. Afterward, Moses and Aaron came and said to Pharaoh. And so after they've talked to the people, they now go and approach Pharaoh. And listen, we need to understand this is a sentence that's put here in this chapter. And we've talked about this a lot before. We're not getting complete records of every word that's spoken and everything that happens. The process to get an audience before a leader like this isn't like just go knock on the door and say, let me in. So there's more to this than it seems on its face. What that process exactly looked like, we don't know, because there is nothing here about it. But I do want us to realize that they didn't just walk into the palace and demand to see Pharaoh. So they get an audience with Pharaoh, and it's the time that they have to go see him. And they say, thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, let my people go, that they may celebrate a feast to me in the wilderness. But Pharaoh said, who is the Lord that I should obey his voice to let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and besides, I will not let Israel go. Is this a surprising reaction? No. And we might even get a similar reaction from somebody today. If we walked up to somebody on the street, just anybody on the street that was engaging in some behavior that's condemned, and we said to them, the Lord God says that you should stop doing that, we would likely get a, what do I care? Who are you? Who's God? And by the way, in the New Testament, there were, in fact, people who got that kind of reaction when they did things from demons, who were told to leave, and they said, well, we know Jesus and we know Paul, but who are you? This is just part of his general arrogance from the position that he has. He is accustomed to giving orders, not receiving them. And so his initial response when he's told, someone has told you to do this, is, who is that to be telling me what to do? And then he ends it by saying, essentially, I'm not going to do it. But it does show that he has no awareness of the Hebrew God, which is telling, because when we get to the New Testament and the Romans dealing with the Israelites, the Roman officials knew well about the Hebrew God and what the Hebrew God said and what the customs and the beliefs and the religion of the Hebrew God involved. Clearly, this guy has no connection to any of that. And he says, well, so what? That's essentially what he says here. So it says that they said, the God of the Hebrews has met with us. Please let us go a 3 days' journey into the wilderness that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God, lest he fall upon us with pestilence or with the sword. And so they up the ante just a little bit, and they explain, look, we've interacted with God. He came to us and met with us and told us these things, and it's in your interest that you do this, because if we don't get to go, then he's going to visit with sword and pestilence. Now, if he visits, in the way it's presented here, he's going to come to us with sword and pestilence. But if he visits the Hebrews in Egypt with sword and pestilence, does that affect the Egyptians? Yes. If not directly, indirectly, and most importantly, if he comes with sword, that is judgment of death, and pestilence, illness, they're losing their slave labor force. If nothing else, that's the implication of this. If it's disease, you also add the risk of that disease moving outside of that population into the Egyptian population and them having to deal with the ramifications of all that. And so that's the point that's being made here. Hey, I want you to understand that there's judgment that comes when you refuse to follow the will of God. And that is an important thing that we always need to keep in mind, because it becomes very easy for people who have been empowered by God to exercise a free will to start forgetting that there is a day in which we will answer for the way in which we exercise that will. That's always what's forgotten about. And so when we get to the epistle from Peter, Peter talks about those who say, well, where is this promise of his coming and all these things? And Peter responds by saying, well, it escapes your notice that God has already done this once with Noah, and that time isn't a constraint for God the way that it is for us. So if he waits 1,000 years to do it, what difference is that? The fact that he will do it is what we need to be aware of. And that we'll all be called onto the account of how we have exercised the will that God has gave us. Yes, correct. It is only a matter of when. And at the fundamental level, you take everything else away. At the fundamental level, we need to understand that we are created, and given the liberty to walk according to our will, and that we will each give an account of how we have done that. Now, there's all kind of stuff that piles on top of that in terms of recognizing God and honoring God and praising God and worshiping God and obeying God's commandments that make that a more involved thing, but the fundamental thing is everything that I do, every choice that I make, every word that I speak, I'm accountable to God for it. Even though I've been given the right to exercise my personal will, that doesn't mean that there isn't an answer that has to be given. That's the part of it people forget. They like that I'm here and they like that I can do what I want to do. They don't like that you have to give an answer. And so when you start saying to people, you're going to have to give an account, you start getting responses like this. Who is God? Why do I have to answer to him? What does that have to do with me? The more modern response that you'll get is, why do I need to worry about what this old book says? That's an old, dead letter from thousands of years ago. What does that have to do with me? That is simply forgetting this basic thing that's being outlined here. The attitude of Pharaoh is not very far removed from every one of our attitudes. Unless we train ourselves to be cognizant of who we are and before whom we stand, and that we will give an answer. And remind ourselves constantly that I'm not as in control as I like to think that I am. All right, so there's going to be this judgment. But the king of Egypt says to them, this is verse 4, Moses and Aaron, why do you draw the people away from their work? Now, again, you see what he's concerned about? He's concerned about the fact that Moses and Aaron talking to them is causing them to be less productive. Why are you drawing them away from their work? Get back to your labors. They've called the people to this big meeting, right? And discussed all these things with them. He says, all you're doing is wasting their time. They should be back to work. Again, Pharaoh said, look, the people of the land are now many, and you would have them cease from their labors? We can't have our entire labor force walk off. What you're suggesting is for all of these workers to just leave. If they go a 3 days journey into the wilderness, then what else has to happen before they get back to Egypt? There's a 3 days journey back. So there's 6 days right there. Not to mention the time that they spend out there doing whatever they're doing. How would the American government like for the entire workforce of the U.S. to take a week's vacation and just not work for a week? What would happen? Listen, even in the middle of COVID, there was a whole block of people that they defined as what? As essential workers that had to keep working anyway. We're talking about this whole workforce just walking away. And he says, remember what you are, remember what you're here for. You need to get back to work. So, the same day Pharaoh commanded the taskmasters over the people of their foremen, saying, you're no longer to give the people straw to make brick as previously. Let them go gather straw for themselves. Now, this is clearly a disciplinary act on the part of Pharaoh. He's kind of put out about the time that's already been wasted and the audacity that they have to come and ask this of him. And so he says, all right, listen, we need to teach them a lesson. Quit providing them the straw that they need for the bricks and make them go out and gather the straw themselves. But that's not all. But the quota of bricks which they're making previously, you shall impose on them. You're not to reduce any of it. And so let them go gather their own straw, but I want productivity to be exactly the same as it was when their supplies were being given to them without them having to gather it. So what does that mean? In order to accomplish this task, they now have greater work to do. They have more work to do, which means more time to do it, which means longer days. So not only am I not letting you go, but I'm going to make you work more. And I'm going to make you work harder, which is nothing but a power play. It is the, let me show you that you don't get to demand of me things. I'm in control. Now, before we go any further, I want to plant a seed. We won't get to this discussion for a few moments, but I'm going to plant a seed. I want you to start asking yourself, what you think Moses and Aaron are thinking about this time? What kind of flack do you think they might get from the Hebrews that they've just convinced that God is going to let them leave? And now, not only are they not leaving, but what? They're having to work harder. How do you think they're going to look at Moses and Aaron? What do we do to our leaders when our leaders make us promises and then it seems like things get worse? What do we do? And then what do leaders do when they start getting that kind of pushback? So I want you to think about this from the perspective of Moses and the Hebrews, as well as from Pharaoh's perspective as we read through it. Verse 9, let the labor be heavier on the men. Let them work at it that they may pay no attention to false words. Okay, so he even gives a motivation, right? He says, I'm going to give them more work to do, make them work longer, make their work harder, so that they don't have time to entertain these foolish ideas. So that the next time Moses says to the people, hey, come together, I need to talk to you, the people say what? I ain't got time. I got my own problems to deal with. Exactly. So the taskmasters of the people and their foremen went out and spoke to the people, saying, thus says Pharaoh, I am not going to give you any straw. You go and get straw for yourselves wherever you can find it, but none of your labor will be reduced. So the people scattered throughout the land of Egypt to gather stubble for straw, and the taskmasters pressed them, saying, complete your work quota, your daily amount, just as when you had straw. So in other words, you got to picture this as being an ongoing thing. And we don't know how big the groups were, but you got your foremans out there, and you got your people that are running the crews. Their job is to keep the people working. And so every day they're having to go out and gather straw. They're having to come back. They're starting to work. They're working. They're starting their brick making later in the day because they've been gathering straw. And the guys are standing over them the whole time saying, now remember, you have to meet the same quota. So get moving. You have work to do, and time is short. The day is coming to a close, and you have a certain number of bricks you have to have done for the end of the day. Don't forget that. Moreover, the foreman of the sons of Israel, whom Pharaoh's taskmasters had set over them. So you got the taskmasters, the supervisors, and then you've got the foreman, and then you've got the work. They were beaten and were asked, why have you not completed your required amount, either yesterday or today, in making brick previously? So in other words, if they fell short of the quota, what happened? They got beaten. The foreman of the sons of Israel came and cried out to Pharaoh, why do you deal this way with your servants? Now, the implication of all this to me is that the taskmaster level were Egyptians. The foreman level were Hebrews. And so the foremen now go to Pharaoh. By the way, I'm not sure that they're talking directly to Pharaoh. They're probably talking to Pharaoh's representatives. But they're saying, hey, why are you treating us this way? There is no straw given to your servants, yet they keep saying to us, make bricks. And behold, your servants are being beaten. But it is the fault of your own people. But he said, you're lazy, very lazy. Therefore you say, let us go and sacrifice to the Lord. In other words, his view on this is the whole thing about going and sacrificing to their supposed God was what? An excuse to get out of work. And now their complaint is, hey, you're not giving us the materials that we need to do what you're asking us to do, and then you're beating us for not doing it. Why are you treating us like this? And he says, don't bother me with this. You're lazy. Go back to work. So go now and work, for you shall be given no straw, yet you must deliver the quota of the bricks. Okay, so what I read in this is the foremen are basically saying, certainly Pharaoh couldn't have said this. Pharaoh must not know that this is what's going on. And Pharaoh says, yeah, I do know this is going on. This is my edict. You go back to work. You're not going to be given any straw, but you must still deliver your quota. And the foremen of the sons of Israel saw that they were in trouble because they were told you must not reduce your daily amount of bricks. In other words, they feel like what? We've been set with an impossible task. We can't do this. So all that can happen is for us to do what? Well, when they're falling short, what's happening? They're being beaten. They're set up for failure here. In other words, the accusation is you've set up the circumstances to justify beating us, because there's no way that we can accomplish this. When they left Pharaoh's presence, they met Moses and Aaron as they were waiting for them. And they said to them, may the Lord look upon you and judge you, for you've made us odious in Pharaoh's sight and in the sight of his servants, to put a sword in their hand to kill us. So when they do have the opportunity to talk to Moses and Aaron, they say what? This is your fault, and all you've done is made the Egyptians mad at us and intent on killing us. Yes, ma'am. Well, Moses hadn't been there for 40 years, so no, he definitely wasn't working. And Aaron, after Moses showed up at least, was with him. What's going on here? The dynamics that's happening here is now the rank and file Hebrew is saying to Moses, you're not helping us. What you're doing isn't good. Now, right here, we need to talk about some other things. What was the origin of this request? Let my people go out into the wilderness, a 3 days journey, and let them worship. That was God's will. We're supposed to be noticing something, that sometimes when you pursue God's will, life doesn't get easier for you. It gets what? It gets harder. Before this request went into Pharaoh, they had a hard life, but things were going along and they were getting the stuff that they needed to do their job, and they weren't being beaten and they weren't under threat of death. But now Pharaoh's mad at them, thinks they're lazy, isn't giving them the things that they need to do their job, then is beating them for not doing their job and threatening to kill them. This is not good, and it's gotten worse. Moses returned to the Lord and said, O Lord, why hast thou brought harm to this people? So I want you to think about what Moses is saying here to God when he asks this question. Moses, I think, is confused. Because remember, and I believe this is part of why we're told all this. We've got this whole thing in chapter 4, right before this, where God is saying, go to Egypt and do this. And Moses is saying what? No, I'm not the guy. No, this is not, no, this is not good. No, God says, listen, it's you. I'm empowering you to be successful. You will accomplish this. Now, there is that little caveat in there where God does tell him ahead of time, Pharaoh's not going to listen to you. But in the middle of the pressure, that's not what Moses is thinking about. This question is, God, why have you put us in this position so that we are suffering? Why haven't you done something? God says, I heard your cry and I came down to help you. But in fact, what they see now is what? Conditions are worse. Why? Why hast thou brought harm to this people? Why didst thou ever send me? Ever since I came to Pharaoh to speak in thy name, he has done harm to this people, and thou hast not delivered thy people at all. I want you to notice that last statement. Moses is saying to God, look, I've come and done what you told me to do, and you haven't delivered these people at all. Now, Moses is forgetting that little piece of information that God gave him. But he's forgetting it. Why? He's under a lot of pressure. Yes, ma'am. Well, there's certainly a lot of pressure going on. There is certainly a period of, and this is an important term, testing that's happening. And there's life lessons for us. We're told in the New Testament that if we are godly and we are seeking to follow Christ, what's going to happen to us? We're going to endure suffering. We're going to endure trials and testing. We're going to be mistreated. Jesus told his disciples, if they mistreated me, then they will mistreat you. What's the point? What's the purpose of the trials and the testings and the difficulties and the hardships? I'm sorry? Okay, to build faith, to test faith. What's the purpose of testing? I just had this conversation with my youngest son yesterday. What's the purpose of testing? To see what you're made of and to identify what? Places that you're weak, places that you need to improve, places that you can improve. The New Testament talks about the fact that we are tested as though by fire. The picture of the crucible is used a couple of times in the New Testament about metals. How do you refine metal and make it pure and usable? Through a crucible, where you have to do what? Burn out the impurities so that what's left is pure. Part of our existence on earth is that process. James chapter 1, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance, and let endurance have its perfect result, that you will be complete, lacking in nothing. So as Jeff observed a moment ago, that's exactly why this is happening, to build faith. Problem is, it doesn't always build faith, because sometimes we don't react to it as we ought to. Sometimes we react to it more like these people are reacting to it, which is saying, you're not helping us. This is just worse. It was bad before, but it was better than now, so I'd rather be in that state than in this state. By the way, after they eventually do get away from the Egyptians, they start complaining again in the wilderness and saying what? It was better when we were in Egypt. Because it was hard. They were not necessarily rising up over the tribulations. Neither was Moses here necessarily rising up over the tribulations. He's getting pressure. He's concerned. He goes to God and says, why did you even send me in the first place if you're not going to deliver him like you said? What is Moses' biggest problem here? He's lacking patience. Because God told him it's not going to happen overnight. He's going to refuse, and there's going to be this process, and I'm going to send plagues, and he's forgetting all that stuff and saying, why aren't we out of here already? That's the exact same kind of question that people ask every day. I've sat across the table from people that said to me, I don't know why I'm still alive. Why am I still here? This isn't any fun. That's exactly what they're saying. There are people that walk away from the faith every day because it's hard and they're not seeing the rewards that they. When do people want to get their reward? Now. When is it promised? Sometime later. And we're told again over and over in the New Testament, don't grow weary in well-doing. In due time, you will reap if you don't grow weary. As long as you keep working and you don't stop, you'll get your reward. Here's the question. Am I going to keep working or am I going to stop? They're having that same issue, that same question. Are we going to wait for God to deliver us in his time? Or are we going to demand that God deliver us now? And those are hard questions. Now, we're going to get to God's answer next time. Yes, ma'am. Actually, it won't be next time.
Pharaoh, apparently the family loved him, but when he found out that Moses killed that Egyptian, he wanted to look for him and kill him. Then he died, and then the next Pharaoh came and didn't know him and hated him. But it was odd that the step-granddaddy hated him.
Well, people just forget. In fact, Moses seems to have forgotten here that God had told him already, this isn't going to be an overnight process. There's going to be a period where Pharaoh is resisting. And there's a sub-level lesson for us to learn as well. When people resist the will of God, what's the result of that? Trouble and hardship. Not always on you, sometimes on the people around you. Pharaoh is resisting the command of God. Who's being hurt by it? The Hebrew people. And eventually, his nation is going to be hurt by it. And until it comes to his house, he's kind of above it all and obstinate about it. We're going to notice that the first time that he really, really pays attention is when it starts affecting him. My refusal to obey God very often affects the people around me more than it does me initially. But just like the reward is delayed and comes later, so is the ultimate judgment delayed and comes later. And that's something we need to keep in mind as well, because that's exactly what Peter's dealing with, trying to get people to understand that just because the judgment is delayed from God doesn't mean that it's not coming. It does. All right, got to stop. Thanks for your presence and your participation tonight.
Wonderful story of love, tell it to me again. Wonderful story of love, with the immortal strain. Angels with rapture announce it, shepherds with wonder receive it. Sinner, oh, won't you believe